It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Luke Dawson found himself staring blankly at his phone screen, scrolling through job listings for what felt like the 100th time. His apartment, a small and cluttered space on the edge of the city, offered no comfort. The walls were bare, the furniture worn, and the light from the half-drawn blinds cast a dull, grayish hue over the room. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but time had become something that escaped him now. In the days following his discharge from the army, it had been hard to find a sense of purpose. A few years as a paratrooper had taught him how to survive in dire situations, how to lead, and how to be strong. But none of those skills seemed to apply in the civilian world. The transition had been harder than he'd imagined. He'd served his country, endured grueling missions, faced danger head-on, and come back home to this, an apartment filled with the echoes of his past, but none of the rewards. There were no medals of honor to display on the walls, no stories of glory shared in crowded rooms. Instead, there were rejection emails, interviews where the hiring managers looked at his resume and questioned why he didn't have a degree or prior experience in more conventional careers. He tried to explain, tried to make them understand that the skills he had honed, resilience, discipline, adaptability, were worth far more than any degree. But all they saw was a man in his late 30s with a history that didn't fit into their neat little boxes. He wasn't a leader here, not in the civilian world. He wasn't even a cog in the machine. He was invisible. That morning, after another round of fruitless job applications, Luke set his phone down and ran his hands over his face. His fingers brushed against the roughness of his stubble, the strain of his situation settling deeper into his bones. He had no plan, no real direction. His savings were dwindling, and the bills were piling up. He needed something. Anything. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Surprised by the unexpected visitor, Luke rose slowly from the couch, his worn-out sneakers sliding against the wooden floor. When he opened the door, he was greeted by a familiar face, Mark, his old neighbor. Mark had always been a steady presence in Luke's life, a guy who had been through some tough times but seemed to have found his way. He was friendly, reliable, but never quite understood the challenges Luke faced transitioning from military life. "Luke, my man." Mark greeted with a broad smile. "You look like you've been through a war." Luke chuckled softly. "Feels like it." Mark stepped inside, hands shoved into his pockets. "I've got something that might help. A job. Not glamorous, but it'll get you some cash. And maybe a little bit of dignity back." Luke raised an eyebrow. "What kind of job?" "Get this," Mark said with an exaggerated grin, "a janitor. At Dr. Blackwell's place. You know, the surgeon? The guy who owns half the city? He's looking for someone to clean his mansion. Pays decent, too." Luke stared at him. The offer hung in the air like a joke he couldn't quite figure out. "A janitor," he repeated, trying to mask the incredulity in his voice. "Are you serious?" Mark shrugged. "Hey, I know it's not what you pictured. But it's work, right? It's not like you've got a lot of options right now." Luke wanted to argue. He wanted to tell Mark that this wasn't the kind of job he had envisioned after leaving the military. But the truth was, he had been looking for anything, and here was something that could pay the bills and maybe even give him a little break. It wasn't ideal, but who was he kidding? His pride had been trampled over the past few months. Maybe a janitor job wasn't such a bad idea. And besides, cleaning a mansion couldn't be that difficult, could it? "Fine," Luke said, nodding reluctantly. "I'll do it." Mark clapped him on the shoulder, a triumphant look crossing his face. "Good man. I'll make the call. You'll start tomorrow." The next morning, Luke stood outside Dr. Blackwell's sprawling mansion. The house loomed before him like a fortress, tall, imposing, with high walls and a sprawling lawn that seemed to stretch on forever. It was one of those houses that made you feel small, insignificant, as if it were a monument to wealth and power. As Luke approached the front door, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The polished marble steps, the meticulously trimmed hedges, it all seemed to mock him. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be this. A butler, older than Luke by at least 2 decades, greeted him at the door. He didn't say much, only handed him a set of keys and directed him to the staff quarters. Dr. Blackwell is in his office. You'll find all you need to start in the utility closet. Luke nodded, trying to act as though this was just another day at a regular job. He followed the butler's instructions, trying to ignore the pangs of doubt creeping into his mind. He had done dangerous things in his life, things that could have killed him. Yet here he was, the former paratrooper turned janitor. The staff quarters were located in the basement, and it felt just as cold and unwelcoming as the rest of the house. The utility closet was tucked away in a corner, stocked with cleaning supplies and tools. And Luke quickly set to work. He began by sweeping the floors of the kitchen, then moved on to the living room. The house was silent except for the sound of his footsteps and the occasional creak of the wooden floors. The house was grand, almost sterile in its cleanliness, and the only thing that seemed to stand out was the feeling of emptiness. As he worked, Luke couldn't help but feel the weight of the house pressing in on him. The entire place was a monument to excess, a place where wealth was flaunted without shame. He didn't belong here. And yet, he had no choice. His life had become a series of compromises, and this was just another one. But as the day wore on, Luke began to wonder if he was compromising too much. Was this all there was for him now? The military had given him purpose, but in a civilian world that didn't understand him, he was adrift, searching for a place to fit in. After a few hours, Dr. Blackwell finally appeared. He was a tall, gaunt man in his late 50s, with sharp features and a clinical air about him. He offered a brief nod as he passed Luke in the hallway, but his gaze never lingered. To Luke's surprise, the surgeon didn't seem all that interested in him, just another worker, just another cog in the machine. And yet, there was something about Dr. Blackwell's cold demeanor that unsettled him. Luke had spent years working alongside soldiers, living in tight-knit units, but the isolation in Blackwell's home felt more suffocating than any mission he'd ever been on. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Luke focused on his cleaning, not wanting to think too much about the strange feeling that had settled over him. He worked without incident, getting into the rhythm of the job, the monotonous scrubbing and sweeping acting as a temporary escape from his inner turmoil. But as the sun began to set, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the emptiness of the house, the quiet that hung thick in the air, it was something else. Something he couldn't yet put his finger on. As he headed to the front door at the end of his shift, Mark appeared again, this time with a grin that seemed a little too wide. "How'd it go?" he asked, practically bouncing on his heels. Luke shrugged. "It's fine, I guess." "Good," Mark said, his eyes twinkling. "Don't let it get to you. It's a good gig. You're making money, right?" Luke nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure if the money was worth the price he was paying. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Luke stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him harder than ever. His future seemed uncertain, his place in the world unclear. But one thing was certain, this job, the mansion, the Blackwells, all of it was just a stepping stone. For better or worse, he needed it. And tomorrow, he would return. To that place, to the sterile mansion that felt more like a prison than a home, and continue down a path he wasn't sure he was ready for. The question that lingered was whether this was his last chance at normalcy, or if something darker awaited him behind the walls of Dr. Blackwell's estate. The next few days passed in an almost surreal blur, each one blending seamlessly into the other as Luke found himself falling into a strange rhythm. His days had become predictable: wake up, prepare for the job, spend hours cleaning the mansion, and then return home to an empty apartment. The silence of his small living space contrasted sharply with the sterile quiet of Dr. Blackwell's home, a place that seemed to pulse with an underlying tension he couldn't shake. Yet, as the days wore on, the reality of his situation started to sink in. The mansion, with its gleaming surfaces and pristine corridors, had begun to feel less like a luxury home and more like an ominous fortress. It was a place that seemed to hold secrets, and Luke couldn't help but feel like he was constantly on the periphery, an intruder in a space that wasn't meant for him. Luke had always been able to adapt to new environments. It was one of the skills that had kept him alive during his time in the military. Whether it was a hostile jungle or a freezing mountain range, he had learned how to find his footing and survive. But this mansion, was different. There was something about the place that unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the grandeur of the house, the expensive artwork lining the walls, or the excessive luxury at every turn. It was the emptiness. There was no warmth in the place. The silence was oppressive, and the air felt thick with something he couldn't name. He had never spoken to Dr. Blackwell much beyond a few cursory greetings when they passed each other in the halls. The surgeon, despite his high status, seemed almost invisible in his own home. He spent hours locked away in his office, only occasionally emerging to speak to Luke or the few other staff members who worked in the mansion. His wife, a woman named Evelyn, was equally aloof. She was a figure who seemed to float through the house, her presence more a shadow than a substance. She would sometimes cross paths with Luke in the kitchen or the grand living room, offering him a polite but distant nod, never exchanging more than a few words. Despite the isolation, Luke couldn't help but notice little things. Strange things. Small details that piqued his curiosity and unsettled him further. For one, the mansion's security system was far more advanced than anything he'd ever seen. Every window was equipped with motion sensors, the doors were reinforced with heavy locks, and there were security cameras everywhere. At first, Luke thought little of it. After all, Dr. Blackwell was a wealthy man, and it made sense for him to protect his assets. But as the days wore on, he began to wonder why the mansion needed such a level of security. It wasn't as though the neighborhood was particularly dangerous. In fact, the area around the mansion was quiet, suburban, and generally safe. But the mansion itself felt like a fortress, one built to keep the world out, and perhaps to keep something else inside. Luke's unease grew with each passing day, but it wasn't until he met Maria that he began to piece together the true nature of what was happening in the Blackwell household. Maria was one of the housekeepers, a woman in her early 40s with a weathered face and a sharp eye. She had worked for the Blackwells for years, and her quiet, watchful demeanor immediately caught Luke's attention. She seemed to know everything about the mansion, its secrets, its corners, and its history. Unlike the rest of the staff, Maria never seemed to be bothered by the house's imposing silence. In fact, she seemed to take comfort in it. At first, Maria barely acknowledged Luke. She was a woman of few words, and when she did speak, her tone was direct and no nonsense. But over time, as Luke continued his work, she began to warm to him. The two started exchanging brief pleasantries, and Luke found himself confiding in her more than he had anyone else. One day, as they sat together in the staff lounge during their break, Maria shared something that made Luke's stomach tighten with unease. "You know, Luke," she said quietly, her voice low as though she didn't want anyone else to hear, "there's something strange about this house. People have always said it's not quite right." Luke looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Maria hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as though to ensure no one was listening. "The Blackwells. They're not exactly who they seem to be. And this house, it's been here longer than they have. I'm not the only one who thinks that there's something off about it. You can feel it, can't you?" Luke had to admit, there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach that had only gotten worse the longer he worked there. "What kind of off?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Maria lowered her voice further. I don't know. I've heard whispers, stories from the old staff. They say there's more to this place than just being a mansion. Some say it's built on land that used to be, well, you know, used for things people don't talk about. Dark things. She gave a half-hearted chuckle, but it was clear she wasn't joking. Luke stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. He'd heard rumors of strange occurrences in old houses, stories passed down through generations, but he never put much stock in them. However, the way Maria spoke, with such conviction, made him question the plausibility of the tales she was hinting at. I'm just saying, Maria continued, watch your back. You don't want to get too close to the Blackwells. There's something about them that doesn't sit right. That night, Luke lay in bed, unable to sleep. Maria's words circled in his mind like a swirling storm. Was she just spinning a yarn to pass the time, or was there something more to it? He didn't know. But there was a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach that told him to trust his instincts. He couldn't shake the sense that the Blackwells were hiding something dangerous. As the days went by, the atmosphere in the mansion grew more oppressive. Luke found himself checking over his shoulder more often, jumping at the slightest noise. There was something in the air, something that he couldn't name but that he felt every time he entered the house. The house itself seemed to breathe, to shift and groan in the dark, as though it were alive. The security system seemed to become more insistent, the cameras watching his every move, and Luke couldn't shake the feeling that he was being scrutinized. It wasn't just the mansion that felt like a prison. He did, too. Then, one afternoon, as Luke was cleaning the lower floor near the study, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. He had been working quietly, sweeping the floor in the hallway outside Dr. Blackwell's office, when he heard raised voices. The door was slightly ajar, and he couldn't help but eavesdrop. I told you, Evelyn, we can't afford any more delays. Dr. Blackwell's voice was sharp and controlled, but there was a hint of frustration. The shipment must arrive by tomorrow, or we risk everything. Evelyn's voice, softer and almost pleading, came through the door next. I understand, but the timing, it's too risky. If anyone finds out what we're doing. I don't care. Dr. Blackwell interrupted. We've come too far to back out now. Do you think I'm going to let some minor setback ruin everything? Luke's heart raced, his instinct screaming at him to leave. He slowly backed away from the door, trying not to make a sound, and retreated down the hallway, his thoughts racing. What was Dr. Blackwell talking about? What shipment? What was happening in this house? That night, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer just an observer in this strange world he had entered. He was a part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. And as the mansion's shadows stretched long into the night, Luke had the unsettling sense that he had stumbled into something far bigger, darker, and more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. And he had no idea what would happen next. The days that followed the overheard conversation only deepened Luke's sense of unease. The more he worked at Dr. Blackwell's mansion, the more he noticed strange details, fragments of conversations, and patterns that didn't quite fit. There were moments when the air felt thicker, as though the walls themselves were listening. The Blackwell estate, once just a grand but empty home, now seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Luke's curiosity gnawed at him, his instinct telling him there was something important he was missing, something sinister hiding beneath the surface of Dr. Blackwell's impeccable life. It wasn't long before Luke's growing paranoia led him to start keeping a mental record of everything. At first, it was just small things, the way the butler, Mr. Harper, would quietly appear from nowhere to check on him, his eyes always scrutinizing, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Then, there were the late-night hours when the lights in the house would flicker on and off, followed by an eerie silence that seemed to linger just a little too long. It was as if the house itself were alive, watching, waiting. Luke had always been a man of action, trained to trust his instincts, but in the face of all the oddities he was witnessing, he felt completely out of his depth. The mansion was a world unto itself, one that didn't make sense. When he wasn't cleaning, he'd sometimes wander through the halls, hoping to understand it all. The rooms, despite being luxurious and immaculately maintained, had a strange, oppressive quality to them. The grand hallways were lined with portraits of past Blackwells, their cold eyes following Luke wherever he went, their expressions frozen in time. Every portrait seemed to tell the same story: wealth, power, control. But beneath that facade, there was something else, something darker, buried deep within the history of the Blackwell family. It was during one of these silent explorations that Luke stumbled across a hidden door. He had been passing through a narrow hallway that connected the study to a small library when he noticed it. At first, he thought it was just another closet or utility room, but the faint outline of a door, cleverly concealed behind a large bookcase, caught his attention. Luke's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. Was this another secret room? Something the Blackwells didn't want anyone to know about? Without thinking, he gently moved the bookcase aside. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit staircase leading down into a basement. The air that rushed up from the darkened passage smelled musty and old, like something that hadn't been disturbed in years. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse quickening. There was no way he should be here. This was a private area, not meant for the eyes of an outsider. But Luke's curiosity got the better of him, and before he could think it through, he descended into the basement, the door silently clicking shut behind him. The basement was cold and damp, the walls lined with old stone that had begun to crack and erode with time. It was far different from the polished, gleaming rooms upstairs. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. Luke's eyes strained in the dim light as he scanned the area. The basement stretched out in front of him, seemingly endless, with shelves filled with crates and boxes. There was something eerie about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Yet, his gaze was drawn to a particular corner, where a large metal door stood. Unlike the rest of the basement, this door appeared new, its surface smooth and without any sign of wear. It stood out in stark contrast to the rest of the room. It looked too deliberate. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to forget what he had found, but Luke couldn't stop himself. He moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the basement, and as he reached the door, his hand hovered over the handle. It was cold to the touch, unnervingly so. He twisted it slowly, and with a faint squeal, the door opened. Beyond it was a small, windowless room, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb. The walls were lined with more shelves, and on them were strange objects, old books, glass jars filled with what appeared to be strange substances, and several wooden crates stacked in the corner, their contents unknown. But it wasn't the items that caught Luke's attention, it was the table in the center of the room. It was a large, metal table, the kind you might find in a laboratory or an operating room, and it was covered in what looked like stains that had been there for a long time, dark and dried. The room itself felt wrong, as though it had been designed for a purpose that Luke couldn't quite fathom. There was an overwhelming sense of unease that settled into his chest. He needed to leave. The longer he stayed, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. But just as he was about to turn and leave, something caught his eye. On the far side of the room, barely visible beneath a stack of old crates, was a thick, leather-bound book. It lay there, partially open, as though it had been carelessly discarded. Driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, Luke crossed the room, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but there were words, written in a language he didn't recognize. It was a strange script, one that looked ancient, almost otherworldly. His eyes scanned the pages, trying to make sense of it, but it was like trying to read a dream, the words slipping through his mind as if they didn't belong to this world. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut behind him, and Luke's heart raced. His head whipped around in panic, but there was no sound. No footsteps. No one was there. It was just the door, slowly creaking closed as if it had a mind of its own. Luke dropped the book in shock, his body frozen in place. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in. His breath came in short gasps as he backed away from the table, his eyes darting around the room. It was as if the basement itself had come alive, and it was trapping him in its grip. For a moment, Luke considered running, breaking through the door and escaping back to the safety of the upstairs rooms. But his feet felt rooted to the ground. He was too terrified to move. It was as if the basement had some sort of hold on him, an unseen force that was keeping him there, preventing him from leaving. And then, just as he was about to lose control, a voice echoed through the silence, a low, gravelly voice that sent a shiver down his spine. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, so quietly that Luke barely heard it. He spun around, but no one was there. His breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen, unable to move or respond. The voice, though, seemed to linger in the air, pressing against him like a weight. It was unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere close, and yet, there was no one in sight. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no rational explanation. For the first time since his discharge from the army, Luke felt genuinely afraid. The world he had stepped into wasn't just strange, it was dangerous, unpredictable, and it was hiding something far darker than he had ever imagined. Just then, the door to the basement flew open with a loud bang. Luke's heart leaped into his throat as he turned to face the figure standing in the doorway. It was Dr. Blackwell, his eyes cold and unwavering, a thin smile playing at the edges of his lips. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Dr. Blackwell said softly, his voice like ice. Luke tried to speak, to form words, but nothing came out. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. The doctor stepped forward, and with each step, the darkness in the basement seemed to deepen, as though the shadows themselves were alive, creeping closer. Luke knew then, without a doubt, that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had uncovered something far bigger than he could have ever anticipated, and the Blackwells were not the people they seemed to be. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now felt like a prison, a place where dark secrets were hidden behind every door, and where Luke was no longer a mere observer but a part of something far more dangerous. Something that, if left unchecked, could destroy them all. Luke's breath caught in his throat as Dr. Blackwell stepped further into the basement, the faint light from above casting long shadows across the room. The air felt heavier now, as if it were closing in around him. The basement, once merely unsettling, had transformed into something far more sinister in the presence of the man standing before him. Dr. Blackwell's eyes were cold, almost predatory, and his expression was unreadable, an eerie mask of composure. The kind of mask that only someone with deep secrets could wear, someone who had spent years perfecting the art of hiding the truth behind a smile. "You shouldn't have come down here, Luke," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice smooth but tinged with something darker, something that made Luke's skin crawl. The words felt like a warning, but they weren't filled with anger. No, there was something far more calculated in the doctor's tone, as though Luke's curiosity had simply been noted and now he was being measured, weighed. Luke's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to turn and run, but his feet remained rooted to the cold floor. His body was frozen, trapped by an invisible force, as if the mansion itself had begun to draw him in, pulling him deeper into its tangled web of mystery and darkness. He opened his mouth, trying to speak, but his voice seemed to fail him. What could he say? What was there to say when the reality of the situation was so much more terrifying than anything he could have imagined? Dr. Blackwell studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if evaluating Luke's every move, his every reaction. Then, without warning, he stepped closer. The space between them seemed to shrink, and Luke could feel the weight of the man's gaze pressing down on him, as though he were being dissected with nothing more than a look. "You've seen it now," Dr. Blackwell said again, this time with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And I suppose I should have expected this." You, of all people, would be curious enough to dig deeper, wouldn't you? His words were laced with something strange, almost as if he were testing Luke, gauging his response to the unseen forces swirling in the background. Luke swallowed hard, his throat dry. He couldn't deny that he had been curious, too curious for his own good. But what had he uncovered? What was the meaning of this basement, of the hidden door, of the strange objects he had seen? The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. But one thing was certain, the Blackwells were involved in something dangerous. Something far darker than he had ever encountered before. You must be wondering what all this is, Dr. Blackwell continued, his tone shifting slightly, as if he were now speaking to an equal rather than an employee. Let me enlighten you, Luke. This isn't just a mansion. This isn't just a home. This is a sanctuary, one that has been built over generations, one that has been carefully crafted to hide the truths we don't want the world to know. Luke's pulse quickened as the doctor's words sank in. A sanctuary? What did that even mean? And what truths was he talking about? Was this some kind of cult, some secret society that had taken root in the heart of the Blackwell family? Was that what he had stumbled upon, something so powerful that they were willing to go to any lengths to keep it hidden? I'm sure you've seen the signs, the oddities, Dr. Blackwell continued, taking another step closer. The excessive security, the strange atmosphere. You felt it, haven't you? The weight in the air, the sense that something is always watching. That's not just your imagination, Luke. It's real. We've spent years creating a place where the past can never catch up to us. A place where we can protect the future from the very things that threaten it. Luke opened his mouth to speak, but Dr. Blackwell silenced him with a gesture of his hand. You're wondering about the basement, aren't you? The book you found? You see, it's all connected. Everything in this house is connected. This mansion, this land, it was built on something ancient. Something powerful. And those who come here, those who work here, are a part of it. Whether they realize it or not. The doctor's words were like a slow-moving tide, pulling Luke further and further into a world he didn't understand. He wanted to run, to escape, to put distance between himself and this man who seemed to have more control over the situation than anyone should. But the pull of the mystery was too great. He needed to know more, to understand what was happening, even if it meant risking everything. Do you remember the stories, Luke? The ones about ancient rituals, about bloodlines and secrets passed down through generations? Dr. Blackwell asked, his voice soft now, almost as though he were telling a long-forgotten tale. You probably dismissed them as myths. But they weren't. And they aren't. The Blackwell family has always been part of something larger. A hidden order, if you will. We've kept our ties buried beneath layers of wealth and prestige, but it's always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. Luke felt a chill run down his spine as the pieces started to click into place. This was no longer just about the Blackwell family being rich and powerful. It was about something far more ancient. Something rooted in history, something that had endured for centuries. Something that had the power to shape not just the family, but the entire world. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. But there was a part of him that already knew deep down that it was true. Dr. Blackwell stepped closer again, his gaze never leaving Luke's face. You've seen enough now to understand, Luke. You've seen the power we wield. And I know you're probably wondering why we're telling you this. Why now? But the truth is, you're already a part of this. Whether you like it or not. You've been chosen. Chosen? Luke managed to croak, his voice trembling with disbelief. Chosen for what? Dr. Blackwell smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver through Luke's body. Chosen to help us preserve what we've built. Chosen to ensure that the secrets of the Blackwell family never see the light of day. There are forces at work here, Luke, forces that are beyond your understanding. And they will stop at nothing to reclaim what is rightfully theirs. Luke's mind spun with confusion and fear. What kind of world was he standing in? How had he gone from being a simple janitor to being drawn into something so dangerous, so far beyond his control? There was no turning back now. Dr. Blackwell's words were too powerful, too real to ignore. You see, Dr. Blackwell said, his voice now lowering to a near whisper, this house, this land, it's not just a home. It's a vessel. A vessel for something far older than you or I, something that requires protection. And it's been our responsibility, for generations, to keep it hidden. But we're running out of time. The world is changing, Luke. The things we've protected for centuries are beginning to stir again. They're waking up, and we need people like you to help us defend them. The basement felt colder now, the shadows deeper. Luke could feel the weight of the doctor's words pressing down on him, and the more he listened, the more he realized that he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. He had thought that the strange occurrences in the mansion, the sense of unease, were just figments of his imagination, but now he understood. It wasn't just paranoia, it was real. There was something in this house, something ancient and powerful, that had been protected at all costs. Luke took a shaky breath, his mind racing. What do you want me to do? Dr. Blackwell's smile widened, as if he had been waiting for Luke to ask the question. That, my friend, is the most important question. Because the answer will shape everything to come. Luke's heart pounded in his chest as the doctor stepped even closer, his voice now barely a whisper. We need you to help us finish what we started, Luke. We need you to protect the legacy of the Blackwell family. And to do that, you must make a choice. The weight of his words settled into Luke's chest like a boulder. The choice. What could that mean? What could he possibly be agreeing to? But before Luke could speak, the doctor's voice cut through the air again, dark and final. Now, let me show you what's next. And with that, everything changed. The moment Dr. Blackwell finished speaking, the room seemed to shift. The air thickened, and for a brief moment, the dim light overhead flickered violently before returning to its subdued glow. Luke's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to process the words that hung in the air between them. It was as if time itself had suspended, each second stretching longer than the last. The weight of what was happening bore down on him, pressing him into the cold, stone floor of the basement. The mansion no longer felt like a home, it was something far darker, something that existed to serve a purpose beyond Luke's comprehension. Luke's pulse quickened, and for the first time in his life, he was unsure of what to do. He had always prided himself on being decisive, on knowing how to handle difficult situations. But this? This was beyond his control. He had thought his life was difficult when he left the military, struggling to find his place in a world that didn't seem to understand him. He had believed that his troubles were behind him when he took the job as a janitor for the Blackwells, nothing more than a paycheck to get by. But now, in the depths of this mansion, surrounded by secrets he couldn't even begin to understand, everything had changed. Luke wanted to refuse, to step away from this twisted game. He wanted to turn and run, never looking back. But something in Dr. Blackwell's eyes told him that running wasn't an option. The choice was no longer his to make. The mansion, the family, the strange forces that seemed to emanate from every corner, everything was intertwined. And Luke was already too deep in the web to escape. Dr. Blackwell motioned for Luke to follow him, his steps echoing off the stone floor as he made his way toward a door at the far end of the basement. The door, unlike the others in the mansion, was heavy and solid, made of dark oak with intricate carvings that seemed almost alive. Luke hesitated, his gaze darting between the doctor and the ominous doorway. It felt like something out of a nightmare, and yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave. The pull of curiosity, of wanting to understand what was happening, was too strong. He had to know. With a deep breath, Luke followed Dr. Blackwell through the door, his feet barely making a sound as he stepped into the room beyond. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The walls were lined with shelves, each one packed with ancient books, scrolls, and jars filled with strange, bubbling liquids. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and something else, something metallic, like blood. At the center of the room stood an altar, made of dark stone, its surface etched with symbols that Luke didn't recognize. The room was lit by the faint glow of candles arranged in a circle around the altar, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and move of their own accord. Luke felt a chill creep up his spine as he stepped further into the room. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was as if the room itself was alive, pulsing with an ancient power. Dr. Blackwell walked to the altar, his hands hovering over the surface as if he were caressing it, and then he turned to face Luke. "This," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice low and reverberating in the silence of the room, "is where it all begins. This is the heart of the Blackwell family legacy. It is here, in this room, that we carry out the rituals that have kept our bloodline strong, kept our secrets safe. And now, Luke, you are part of it." Luke's mouth went dry, his mind racing. What was he talking about? Rituals? Bloodlines? The images of the strange book, the hidden door, and the cryptic symbols flashed through his mind. What was this place really? What had he stumbled upon? "You see," Dr. Blackwell continued, his eyes glinting with a strange fervor, "our family has been protecting something for centuries, something powerful, something ancient. The Blackwell name carries a weight, a responsibility. And it is that responsibility that you will now share." Luke shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though he were being pulled deeper and deeper into a dark, impenetrable labyrinth, one with no way out. He glanced around the room again, taking in the jars, the books, the altar. Everything felt like it was designed for something far darker than anything he had encountered. The hairs on his arms stood on end, and an icy dread settled in his stomach. Dr. Blackwell smiled, almost as if he could read Luke's thoughts. "You're wondering what all this means, aren't you? What role you will play in all of this?" Luke nodded, his voice finally breaking free. "What do you want from me?" Dr. Blackwell's expression softened, almost pityingly, as he walked closer to Luke. "I'm not asking you to be anything you're not, Luke. You're here because you were chosen. You were chosen because of your strength, your loyalty, your ability to do what others cannot." He stopped in front of Luke, his gaze unwavering. "You may not understand it now, but in time, you will." Luke's mind was spinning, and the weight of Dr. Blackwell's words pressed on him like a physical force. He could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thinner, as though the room were somehow alive, alive with an ancient purpose, a purpose that he was now a part of, whether he liked it or not. Suddenly, the floor beneath their feet trembled. The walls seemed to shift, and the candles flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. Luke's breath hitched as the tremors grew stronger, and a low, rumbling sound echoed through the basement. It wasn't just an earthquake, this was something else, something far more unsettling. The room seemed to be alive, responding to some unseen force. "Do you feel it?" Dr. Blackwell's voice was a whisper now, barely audible above the growing noise. "The power? The energy? It's awakening, Luke. After all these years, the time has come. We can no longer hide it. We can no longer keep it buried." Luke's heart pounded in his chest as the tremors intensified. The symbols on the altar began to glow with a faint, otherworldly light, casting strange patterns across the walls. The room seemed to be shifting, warping around them, and Luke's vision blurred as the energy in the air thickened. What's happening?" Luke gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The ritual," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice filled with a strange reverence. "It has begun. And you, Luke, are the key." Luke's mind raced. Ritual? What ritual? And what did he have to do with it? Before he could ask any more questions, Dr. Blackwell reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch was cold, sending a shock of ice through Luke's body. He wanted to pull away, to break free from whatever hold Dr. Blackwell had on him, but the doctor's grip was unyielding. It was as though the man's touch was somehow tied to the very power of the mansion itself. "This is where you belong now, Luke," Dr. Blackwell whispered, his voice smooth and calm in contrast to the chaos around them. "The Blackwell legacy is now yours to protect. The power is yours to wield." The air crackled with electricity, and the room seemed to pulse with life, as if the very foundations of the house were alive with energy. Luke's head spun, his thoughts a blur. He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear: he was in too deep. There was no going back. And as the power in the room reached its peak, Luke's mind began to race with one question: what had he really become? The air in the basement was thick with tension, crackling with an energy that felt like it could tear the very walls apart. Luke's senses were on high alert, his body rigid with fear, but also with a strange, almost primal sense of anticipation. The room was alive, pulsing with an invisible force that seemed to reverberate in his bones. He stood frozen in place, barely able to breathe, as Dr. Blackwell's hand remained firmly on his shoulder, a steady anchor in the storm of confusion and fear that was overwhelming him. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the strange symbols on the walls, the flickering candles, the altar covered in ancient carvings. He felt as if he were standing on the precipice of something much larger than himself, something that had been brewing for centuries, and now, he was a part of it. The tremors that had started to shake the floor were now subsiding, but the strange energy in the room was still palpable. It was as though the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And Luke, whether he was ready or not, was the one who had been chosen to play his part in whatever was coming next. What is this? What am I supposed to do? Luke finally managed to choke out, his voice hoarse from the strain of trying to process the chaos swirling around him. He couldn't seem to think clearly, everything was happening so fast, too fast. His mind raced, trying to make sense of Dr. Blackwell's cryptic words, but they only added to the confusion. Dr. Blackwell's grip on Luke's shoulder tightened, his fingers pressing into the fabric of Luke's shirt with an almost suffocating intensity. "You felt it, haven't you? The power? The energy?" The doctor's voice was low and hypnotic, like a chant that sent shivers down Luke's spine. "You're more than just a bystander, Luke. You're part of the ritual now. You were always meant to be. You've been chosen to carry on the legacy. The bloodline. The power." Luke's stomach lurched. This wasn't just about a mansion. This wasn't about cleaning floors and making sure everything was in order for a wealthy family. This was about something far darker, something that had been carefully hidden from the outside world for centuries. He felt sick to his core. But there was also a part of him, buried deep beneath the fear, that couldn't deny it, that couldn't ignore the pull of the unknown. He had always wondered why he had been drawn to this job, why it felt different from all the others he had taken before. Now, he understood. This was no accident. He had been led here, guided to this moment, for reasons he couldn't yet comprehend. "Look at it, Luke," Dr. Blackwell continued, his voice growing more insistent. "The altar. The symbols. They're all part of a great and ancient power, one that has been passed down through our family for generations. This power is the key to everything. The Blackwell name carries with it a responsibility. A duty. We protect what is sacred, what is hidden from the world, because the world is not ready for it. And now, you are a part of that responsibility." Luke's eyes were drawn to the altar, the strange markings etched into its surface. There was something about them that seemed to call to him, something about the way the symbols seemed to shift and change when he looked at them, as though they were alive. His heart raced, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the room pressing down on him, as if the very air had thickened around him. Dr. Blackwell's voice broke through his thoughts again. "You've been brought here for a reason, Luke. The family needs you. The world needs you. What we are about to do is bigger than anything you can imagine. And you, Luke, are the one who will carry it forward. You're the one who will protect it." The words were like a siren call, urging Luke deeper into the web of mystery and danger that had already ensnared him. But a flicker of doubt still remained, the faintest spark of resistance in the pit of his stomach. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me? What is this legacy?" Dr. Blackwell's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Luke saw something dark and dangerous flicker behind them. The doctor seemed to take a step back, considering him, weighing him with a cold, calculating gaze. "The Blackwell legacy is about power," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice low and measured. "It's about control. About keeping what is ours hidden from the world. The world doesn't deserve to know the truth, Luke. It's too dangerous. And so, we protect it. We ensure that the power remains safe. And now, you will help us do that." Luke felt a chill run down his spine as the full weight of the doctor's words began to sink in. This wasn't just about protecting a family fortune or keeping their secrets hidden. No, this was about something far darker. It was about control, control over knowledge, over power that the rest of the world could never understand. And Luke, for reasons he still couldn't fully grasp, had been chosen to be a part of it. A sharp pain shot through Luke's head, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to spin. He staggered, reaching out for support, but Dr. Blackwell's hand was there again, steadying him. "What's happening?" Luke gasped, his vision blurring. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart pounded violently in his chest. "You're feeling it now," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice calm despite the chaos in Luke's mind. "The energy is awakening within you. You're becoming a part of the ritual, Luke. You're connecting to the power that flows through the Blackwell family. It's in your blood now. It always has been." The room seemed to shift again, and Luke felt the ground beneath him tremble. The symbols on the altar were glowing now, their light growing stronger with each passing second. It was as if the room itself was coming alive, responding to the ritual that was taking place. The air hummed with energy, and Luke could feel it surging through his veins, coursing through him like a fire that couldn't be extinguished. "You will help us, Luke," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice now a whisper, almost a chant. "You will protect what we have protected for centuries. You will carry the legacy forward." Luke's mind was spinning. The pain in his head was becoming unbearable, and yet, at the same time, there was something else, something powerful, that was beginning to awaken within him. He could feel it, deep in his soul, pulling him toward the altar, toward the symbols that seemed to beckon him with an almost hypnotic force. It was as though something inside him was waking up, responding to the call of the Blackwell legacy. "You're part of it now," Dr. Blackwell continued, his voice soft but filled with an undeniable authority. "And you'll never be the same again." Luke wanted to fight it, to scream, to run away from this madness, but he couldn't. The power was too strong, too overwhelming. It was inside him now, just as it had always been. And as much as he wanted to resist, as much as he wanted to escape, he knew deep down that there was no going back. In that moment, Luke realized the truth. He wasn't just a janitor. He wasn't just a man trying to get by. He was a part of something far greater, something that had been shaping his fate all along. The Blackwell family, their secrets, their power, it was all now a part of him. And there was no turning back. The room seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost too much to bear, and Luke could feel the power surging through his veins, merging with his own essence. It was as if he had become one with the mansion, with the legacy that had been passed down through the generations. And as the energy continued to rise, Luke understood. He was no longer just an outsider. He was one of them. And he would do whatever it took to protect the Blackwell legacy. For better or for worse.